Greetings and welcome to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. My name is Charles Woods, and I'm the Education Director and Trainer here at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And today we have a kind of a different discussion, but we have an informational talk about CRT with a college perspective. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, the opinions expressed as part of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute presentations are solely those of our panelists and do not express the views or opinions of their affiliates. To enlighten, and our vision is to enlighten each generation about civil and human rights by exploring our common past and working together in the present to build a better future. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our co-panelists today. We have Abigail and Afiya. And I want you all to go ahead and introduce yourselves and tell us just a little bit about yourselves before we get started. Abigail, we'll go ahead and start with you.
So much. So my name is Abigail Romero. I'm a current junior at Harvard College studying applied math and economics. I yield from Long Island, New York, spent some time in Atlanta, Georgia this past break. And I'm incredibly excited to be speaking to all of you today on CRT.
Thank you. Afiya?
Hi, everyone. My name is Afiya Rahman. I am a current sophomore at Harvard College studying social studies, and I'm from Syracuse, New York, and I'm truly honored to be here and have this discussion.
So I want to thank you all so much for being here. I also want to thank our Civil Rights Fellow, John Paul, for helping establish this program. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. Question one, can you all begin by providing an introduction to what exactly is critical race theory? Afiya,
Yes.
Did I pronounce that correctly? Let's start with you.
Yeah, so critical race theory has been around for several decades. It began as a legal and academic framework to examine laws, policies, and institutions to look deeper and think critically about how racism has been woven into these institutions outside of just individual bias and prejudice. So I think critical race theory is simply a method and a framework to examine how history has created these inequalities and how they've been embedded into our systems. You know, why is it, for example, that we are taught about our founding fathers, but we don't address the atrocities committed against Native Americans? You know, why is it that slavery and Jim Crow is denounced as un-American and a part of the past when they inform our present and the makeup of America today, where people of color are still subjected to brutality? So I think today, critical race theory has become a hot button issue across the United States, despite being around for many, many decades. And more than 20 states have introduced legislation to ban lessons on racism and other concepts that are deemed too divisive to talk about. So I think it's become a political weapon, misconstrued as a political weapon, and that's why it's under such fierce backlash and debate today.
Great, great. Abigail, do you have any insight on why you think they're starting to ban it across the country?
Because there's been just a huge surge in talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion writ large. And so what we saw within the Trump administration, namely, was the passing of his executive order that pretty much looked to place a blanket ban on talks including race, gender, etc. And of course, critical race theory was swept under that. And I think to that point, I think it's really important to realize that sort of in the context of DE&I and CRT, while DE&I can involve discussions of race, sexuality, gender, religion, culture, etc., critical race theory is a really important node of that conversation, which is why it is super imperative in our dialogue to continue to keep CRT, at the forefront, to fight back against anti-CRT legislation. As Afiya mentioned, has become there has been legislation introduced in more than 20 states that is looking to ban CRT discussions in classrooms and otherwise.
All right, so what is the intention behind CRT, and how does implementing CRT fit in with a broader discussion surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, so an interpretation, sorry, go ahead. So an interpretation that I really like to point to is that of Kimberly Crenshaw's, where she mentions that CRT is not a noun, but rather a verb, in the sense that, something that is introduced into conversation and should be engaged with in a really meaningful way. And essentially what CRT hopes to bring into this conversation is to acknowledge that the inequities and inequalities that Black and Brown persons face in years today is very much a product and a function of past inequalities that we've seen. For example, on the topic of structural and systemic racism. I mean, this is, of course, just a historical fact, right? Because we've seen the United States engage in very blatant cases of racism, xenophobia, white supremacy. I mean, let's talk about 400 years of slavery, Japanese internment camps during World War II, Chinese Exclusion Act, anti-miscegenation statutes, and we can go on and on and on. And just acknowledging that these laws, these statutes, these systems are not only in place, but they're government sanctioned, I think is so important to understanding, the present day failures that we see in our systems when it comes to treating those who are not of the ethnic or racial majority, that is Black and Brown persons, with the same equality. And so I think that really is, how CRT enters the conversation, just painting a more holistic picture of the inequalities that we see present day, as well as bring to the forefront how past wrongs can manifest and perpetuate their time into present inequities.
And I understand that, we all have a tendency to interpret history differently. And so, and CRT is also kind of falling up under that same understanding that everyone has their different, concept of what it means. And so why do y'all think it means different things to different people? Afiya, we can go ahead and start with you on that one. I think she may be frozen for a moment. Abigail, can you pick that up for us?
Yes, of course. So I think a lot of the resistance and pushback that we've seen with CRT, whether that be in legislation or otherwise, is really, I think, like a fundamental lack of understanding of what exactly critical race theory means and what is it is attempting to sort of play into the conversation. And so I think, so there's this writing that Ibram X. Kendi talked about, when we have something as complex as a theory, as critical race theory, sometimes a lot can be muddied, a lot can be misunderstood across parties with political differences. And so I think at a very baseline, a lot of the pushback is because of a misunderstanding. But even more than that, I think it's just become very advantageous to kind of broaden the scope of what exactly critical race theory is, or maybe tamper with what critical race theory is. For example, oftentimes you'll hear the opposition say that critical race theory is trying to institute racism within schools or teach racism. And that is not the case, right? Like, no one is trying to kind of pin a certain group of people or alienate them, antagonize them in any way. I think just understanding that in the United States, there has been like a racial majority that has held power and has put into place things like you mentioned prior, slavery, Jim Crow laws, etc., and how that continues to impact us in the present day is just an important reckoning that we have to continue engaging with. And then I think to that point, as we see with anti-CRT legislation, if CRT is trying to be legislated against, I think in the words of Victor Ray, making laws outlawing CRT kind of confirms that the point of racism is embedded in these laws. So I think that when I first read that, that was incredibly enlightening.
Afiya, you want to go ahead and jump in?
Yeah, so I think what Abigail mentioned is really important. I think the ban of, talking about history is completely ridiculous. I think the United States has had, as Abigail mentioned, blatant cases of racism and xenophobia, and it's deeply embedded in our history. And to look at these anti-CRT bills, that it's not so much an attack on CRT, it's more of an attack on talking about racism at all. And that seems to be, CRT has sort of become this umbrella term to talk about anything related to racism or xenophobia. And it's become utilized as a political weapon to sort of just deny any accountability for the past, or have any uncomfortable discussions, or talk about topics that they deem too divisive.
And that kind of segues us right into our next question. How does America's past history inform CRT and education today, but also kind of talk about how the history's not the same for everyone. Everyone has a different idea of exactly what occurred, and how we have to get to an understanding of everyone's part in our history to really even start dialing the dial forward anyway. Go ahead, Afiya.
Yeah, sorry. So I think this is such an important question, and history has so much to tell us. So I think critical race theory is all about looking at how that past has informed the present today. How did state-sponsored segregation, redlining affect the makeup of our cities and neighborhoods? How have quotas and Chinese exclusion affected how we view immigrants and how we view Asian Americans today? It's all about asking these questions and looking deeper. I think in education, especially in K through 12 schools, it's really important for students to engage critically rather than shying away from topics deemed too controversial or uncomfortable. History should be confronted so that we can utilize it and act for change. I think there's no power in sanitizing history, only telling one dominant narrative that's been told for centuries. Continues to exclude people of color and foster environments where students don't feel adequately represented. It's really important to confront this history and to use it because it has power.
Abigail, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, just emphasizing everything that was just mentioned. But I think even more than that, just understanding that CRT is really looking to paint this holistic picture of history, like Afiya mentioned, um, and kind of having that in conversation with past histories, whether that be that we're taught in schools, taught in upper level education, and sort of learn and relearn through that process that is engaging with critical race theory.
And these things are kind of reminiscent of um, getting to a point where there's no history that's being discussed at all, right? And then you get into points where you start to burn books, or books have become non-important in education, and so we may be leaning towards a dark place if things keep going the way that they're going. But what are some ways that we can learn more about critical race theory and how we can engage with CRT in a meaningful way? How can we start having these conversations that really help people understand that we have to be critical, of the way we've been taught in the past and the information that has been given across.
Right. I can start us off. So critical race theory is obviously a very complex issue to engage with. So for me, what I've found to be really helpful in my understanding and own journey has been, just reading about it at a definitional level. So for example, reading things published by the NAACP or the Brookings Institute have been really helpful. Or also engaging in the debates, whether that be for the pro or anti-CRT side as well. Reading through legislation, really understanding sort of what CRT means and how it has sort of entered the mainstream has also been very important.
Yes, and I think asking these questions is the first step. Every day, more and more people are beginning to realize how deeply rooted this systemic racism is. And by beginning to meaningfully engage with history and thinking critically, we can begin to enact change and work towards a more equitable outcomes for everyone. I think really examining these bills and the languages that's used, why is it that racism is deemed too divisive to talk about in schools when it's the living reality for, people of color across the country? So I think really engaging and thinking critically and asking important questions and looking deeper is really important to understanding critical race theory and also utilizing it for change.
Well, I really enjoyed our time together today. You two young ladies are very dynamic, and I just want to say thank you for joining us today. And any last thoughts that you all want to leave with our audience today? Abigail?
Yes, I think engaging with hard ideas, although it can be difficult, is incredibly important, especially in our modern day where oftentimes we're so divisive, so divided. I think being able to listen to opposing points of views, engaging in free speech, engaging with others is the only way that we can move forward in a really constructive way for ourselves.
Afi?
Yeah, I think it's always important to have these uncomfortable conversations, even though they might be difficult. But I think it's really important to engage and sort of go outside our comfort zone. and only then can we work towards a better future.
That's exactly what I would have said. And the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute used to be that place where we can have those difficult conversations and have that uncomfortable discussion, all in all in the name of progress and trying to steer this country forward and our world forward. So thank you all very much. Once again, my name is Charles Woods. I want to say thank you again to John Paul, our Civil Rights Fellow, for setting all of this up, and these two dynamic young ladies to join us from Harvard College. So thank you once again. Have a good day.